The morning she brought the first 8 of them down the county road, it was a Tuesday in early October of 2003, and the sky was the color of old pewter left on a shelf, flat and cold, and waiting to do something about it. I remember because I was fixing a section of woven wire along the south pasture, and I stopped what I was doing and just watched the trailer come through. You could hear them before you could see the rig clearly, that particular hollow sound a horse trailer makes when the animals inside are not standing easy, not swaying together with the road, but moving in short, violent arcs against the walls, hooves finding steel in ways that have no rhythm to them at all. The trailer was an old gooseneck, white paint gone to chalky gray, and it was being pulled by a truck that had seen better years, which I will say fit the overall picture she was assembling that morning without her yet knowing it was a picture at all. She pulled through the gate of the Alderman Place, which nobody had called anything but the Alderman Place for 30 years, even though the Aldermans had sold it in 1991. And she did not stop to wave or explain herself, which I would come to understand was simply how she operated. I stood there with my fence pliers in one hand, and I watched the trailer go up the 2-track toward the old working pens in the near corner of the north field, and I thought, well, there is going to be a story here by noon. I was not wrong. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. The way it was told, she had bought 28 horses that no outfit in 3 states would keep, horses that had been through 2 or 3 rodeo strings and washed out, horses that had injured riders and been passed along again until the price had dropped below the floor of sensible economics, and she had paid something in the neighborhood of $340 a head for horses that a kill buyer would have given her $400 for without blinking. That detail, the kill buyer number, got repeated at that counter with a particular emphasis, the way a detail gets repeated when people are trying to decide whether a person is brave or just not good at arithmetic. I will say this. I drove past the Alderman Place 3 evenings that first week, not slowly, not with any intention of stopping, just driving past. And each time I could see her out in the failing light, working the near pen alone, not trying to do anything with the horses, just being in the space with them, moving along the fence line the way you move when you are not yet asking anything of anyone. I thought about my grandmother, who had a word for that approach, a word I cannot reproduce exactly because it was hers, but it meant something like the patience before the patience, the waiting you do before you are even sure what you are waiting for. I did not stop and say this to the woman at the Alderman Place. I am telling you that plainly because I want to be honest about my reasons. I did not stop because I was not sure she would want the commentary, and because I was not sure I had earned the right to offer any. But I watched. I kept watching. And what I saw in those first 2 weeks was this. The horses were coming off the fence. Not all of them, not fast. But the ones who had been pressing the far rails, the ones who had been announcing with their whole bodies that the pen was a trap and a trap was a thing to be destroyed, those horses were beginning slowly, not quite willingly, but not quite unwillingly either, to stand in the middle ground of the pen when she was in there with them. That sounds like a small thing if you have not spent time with horses that have decided people are a category of problem. It is not a small thing. It is, in the language of that work, an enormous thing, and it happens on the horse's schedule, not yours. And the only contribution you can make to it is to be present and steady, and ask nothing before it is time to ask anything. She was doing that. She was doing it with 28 horses simultaneously, rotating through them in a sequence I eventually understood had its own logic, spending longer in the pen with the ones who were furthest from the middle and shorter with the ones who were closer, because the ones in the middle did not need her time as badly, and she was operating, though she had not said so to me or to anyone I knew of, on a kind of triage system built from attention rather than force. The extension agent came out in the 3rd week. I know this because I saw his truck, which was white and clean in the way that county vehicles are clean when they are not used for actual ranch work, parked along the road outside the gate. He was leaning on the top rail of the outside pen with a clipboard, and I could tell from his posture, even at the distance I was at, that he was composing a number in his head. He had that look. You know the look of a man who has been given a formula and is running the variables and is very nearly certain of the answer before the last number goes in. I do not know exactly what he said to her. I know what he said to the feed store that afternoon because Denny Marsh was there buying mineral blocks, and Denny told me later. The extension agent had said, and I am giving you the substance if not the precise words, that the carrying cost on 28 problem horses, feed and farrier and wormer, and the liability of the thing was going to run her somewhere between $9,000 and $11,000 a month, and that the market for horses that had washed out of rodeo strings was, at that moment, not what it needed to be for the numbers to close. He had said this in the helpful tone of a man who believes he is preventing a loss rather than insulting an intention. She had thanked him and gone back into the pen. He had stood at the rail a minute longer and then gotten in his clean truck and driven back to town, which is what clean trucks tend to do. What he did not know, what nobody in that county knew, yet except possibly her and possibly the horses, was what was underneath the north field of the Alderman place. I did not know it yet either. I want to be plain about that. I had farmed adjacent ground for 19 years at that point, and I had assumptions about that land the way you have assumptions about a neighbor's place when you have looked at it for nearly 2 decades without ever having reason to look closely. It was a hard field, wet in the corners, hard pan toward the Butte on the north edge, a hillside that shed water faster than it could use it, and a bottom that held water longer than anything wanted. The Alderman family had run a few stocker cattle on it and cut hay off the lower third in good years and otherwise left it largely to its own opinions. Nobody had ever put a crop on the north field. Nobody had tried. The common understanding, the ambient inherited wisdom of the community as regarded that particular piece of ground was that the Butte shed everything and the bottom drowned everything, and the middle third was too thin to bother with. And that was that. I had accepted this understanding the way you accept a fact about topography, not because you verified it yourself, but because enough people who seemed to have paid attention to it had arrived at the same conclusion without being asked to coordinate. This is how a lot of things get decided about land, not by examination, by agreement. And agreements made without examination have a particular kind of confidence to them that is very hard to argue with, until the land itself provides the argument. I will tell you what provided the argument. But first I have to tell you about the horses, because without the horses there is no argument, there is no discovery, there is no story worth sitting down to hear. The horses are the reason for everything that followed. She knew that. I think she may have known it from the beginning, though I would not have the conversation with her that confirmed this for another 14 months. What the horses knew, they knew, from the moment the trailer came through that gate on that pewter sky Tuesday in October of 2003. What they knew, I was still learning, and you can't rush what you're still learning. My grandfather used to say that a man in a hurry is a man describing the future he expects rather than reading the present he's in. I have found that to hold. She had the horses through the winter, all 28 of them, and the winter was not cooperative. We had a hard freeze come in before Thanksgiving that year that locked up the water tanks and stayed. I know because I lost 42 feet of aluminum pipe in my west lot to that freeze, and it cost me more than I care to recount to a general audience. The horses on the Alderman place were through it on a regimen that I would have called austere if I had been asked to characterize it, though I was not asked. She was feeding good grass hay, 2 flakes per head twice a day in the heavy cold, and she had a bank of black rubber tanks she was breaking ice on every morning before 7, and that was the operation. No shelter built yet, though she had wind-blocked the north corner of the pen with old highway billboard panels she had gotten from somewhere, 6 of them 12 feet tall and weathered into near illegibility, and the horses found that corner on the worst nights, and stood shoulder to shoulder in it, the way horses will when they are cold and have decided provisionally to trust the structure they have been given. I watched this from my truck on several mornings in January. I was not watching her particularly. I was watching the horses. I want to be clear about this distinction because it is relevant to what I was trying to understand. What I was watching was whether a horse that had come off a rodeo string with a history of injuring people could be brought through patience alone to a different set of operating assumptions. What I saw in January was that the answer appeared to be yes, and that the mechanism of the change was something quieter and slower than anything the extension agent's formula could measure. By February, she had 7 of the 28 on a loose lead. Not broke to ride, not trying to be broke to ride, just accepting the rope and the presence of a person at the end of the rope and moving forward when asked in a slow arc around the inside of the pen. 7 horses in 4 months who had, according to every rodeo outfit that had ever written a ticket on them, been structural problems with 4 legs. By March, she had 11. I started stopping at the gate in March, not often, 3 or 4 times. I would pull up and she would come over after a bit, and we would talk across the top rail the way people do when they are feeling each other out about whether a longer conversation is warranted. She did not explain herself in those conversations, and I did not ask her to. I asked about the horses, and she answered about the horses, and once I asked if she'd had any trouble with the frozen corner of the near pen where the slope drained toward the gate, and she said it had been soft but was firming, and I said that whole north section stayed soft longer than it looked like it should, and she looked at me then with a specific quality of attention and said, yes, she had noticed that. That was March of 2004, and it was a small exchange that I have thought about many times since. There was a notebook. There is always, in a story worth telling, a notebook. This one belonged to her grandfather, a man who had worked that ground and adjacent ground in the late 1940s and through the 1950s before a consolidation of debts and a bad summer had moved the family off it in 1961. She had the notebook because her mother had kept it, and her mother had kept it because her grandfather had been a man who wrote things down in a way that suggested he believed the writing was a responsibility rather than a habit, which is a different thing entirely and produces a different quality of notebook. I did not see the notebook myself until the following autumn, October of 2004, almost exactly 1 year after that first trailer had come through the gate. But she had been working from it all along, or working in the direction it pointed, which is perhaps more accurate. The notebook was a composition book, black and white marbled cover, the corners soft as flannel from a half-century of handling, and inside it her grandfather had kept field notes in a pencil that had gone the color of old tobacco. Measurements, drainage observations, notes on where water stood and for how long, and after which storms, and at what temperatures. Notes on the soil horizon in different sections, how deep the dark went before it changed character, what the subsurface looked like when he put a probe to it. He had been methodical in the way that a man who has been failed by the land once already is methodical, which is to say, he had been making himself know the ground rather than assume it. There were 37 pages of this, and on page 22, near the bottom, in the careful hand of a man who chose his words because he did not have unlimited patience for the ones that didn't earn their place, there were 2 sentences that she had underlined in pencil, underlined twice, and beside which she had drawn a small asterisk. The sentences read, "The seep at the base of the Butte runs year-round, even in the '54 drought. Have not found where it originates." Below that, in a hand that had changed slightly, written later, perhaps in a different season, were 3 words with a question mark at the end. Water below here? That was the whole of it. Water below here. A question from a dead man who had noticed something, and had not, in the years he had left on that ground, found the time or the means, or perhaps the confidence to follow it all the way to an answer. She had found the question. She had come back to find the answer. And she had brought 28 unrideable horses with her as the instrument of the investigation, which is exactly the kind of approach that looks, from the county road, like a person who is not good at arithmetic. I want to explain what the horses had to do with it, because this is the part that the extension agent's formula could not have reached, and the part that I find most worth sitting with when I think about the whole of what happened. A horse that has been through rough handling and a rodeo string and a sequence of owners who gave up on it does not walk the same ground as a horse that has been settled and schooled and kept on pasture it knows. A rough horse, a horse that is still working out whether the world intends to harm it, moves differently. It moves with its nose closer to the ground than a confident horse. It tests surfaces before committing to them. It avoids the places it doesn't trust and seeks the places it does, and the places it seeks are the places where the ground gives it something reliable, consistent, honest. When she turned the horses in spring and then in early summer onto the north field for the first time, she was not simply providing them grass. She was reading them. She was watching where they went and where they avoided, and how they distributed themselves across an uneven, complicated, difficult piece of ground. And she was making a map from their behavior that no instrument she could afford would have generated as cheaply or as accurately. By June of 2004, she had a pattern. The horses were working a diagonal across the lower north field from the southwest corner toward the base of the Butte, and along that diagonal, in the mornings particularly, in the low ground that stayed cool even when the rest of the field had dried, they were grazing and standing and returning day after day to a strip no more than 60 feet wide and 300 feet long that ran at an angle toward the rock at the base of the Butte face. They were not distributing themselves evenly across the available grass. They were concentrating along a line. She was drawing that line on a hand-drawn map she was making in a composition notebook of her own, one that she had bought at the hardware store in town, and was keeping in the same spirit as her grandfather had kept his, which is to say, as a responsibility. She showed it to me in October. She showed me her notebook and her grandfather's notebook side by side on the tailgate of her truck, and the line she had drawn from the horse's movement mapped almost exactly over the note on page 22 about the year-round seep and the question below it. The horses had found the water, or rather, the water had found the horses, because the water had always been there, and the horses were simply the ones paying close enough attention to know it. I brought Lloyd Sutter out in November. Lloyd had been a well driller and a subsurface water consultant for 31 years, and had retired to a place 12 miles east of me, where he raised good-natured cattle and answered questions when people brought him something worth thinking about. He was 73 years old, and he did not own a clipboard, and he drove a truck that looked like it had been used for the purposes a truck is for, which is to say, extensively and without excessive concern for its appearance. I called him on a Wednesday evening, and he came out on that following Friday morning when the ground was frozen just hard enough at the surface to ring slightly under a boot heel, which is the kind of morning Lloyd liked for reading subsurface behavior, because the frozen crust, he said, told you things about what was happening below it that you didn't get when the surface was soft. We walked the north field for 2 hours. Lloyd walked it the way an old man walks ground he is trying to understand, which is slowly and with a great deal of stopping. He had a probe, a 48-inch soil rod he'd made himself from quarter-inch steel, and he put it into the ground at 17 points along the diagonal she had mapped from the horse's movement. He pulled it up each time and examined the tip and rubbed what came up between his thumb and 2 fingers, and sometimes smelled it, and set it back in a bucket of water he was carrying and moved on. He did not say anything for most of the 2 hours. She walked with us for the first hour and then went back to the pens, and it was Lloyd and me on the frozen field for the second hour, and I had the good sense to say nothing and simply keep up with him. When we got to the 7th probe location from the northern end of the line, which put us approximately 220 feet from the base of the butte, Lloyd pulled the rod up and held it for longer than he had held any of the others. The tip was darker than the earlier pulls, a specific dark that was different from the dark of organic matter and different from the dark of clay. A dark with a kind of heaviness to it that I have since learned to recognize, but could not, at that moment, name. Lloyd held it for perhaps 45 seconds. He set it carefully across the top of the bucket rather than into it. He stood up from the crouch he'd been in and looked at the butte face, and then down the line of the diagonal toward the southwest, and then back at the rod tip. And the silence that came off him in that moment was not the silence of a man who has nothing to say, but the silence of a man choosing the right size of container for what he is about to put in it. He said one word. He said substantial, not loud, not with any particular triumph in it. Just the word, offered plainly, the way a man who has been in the ground his whole working life says a thing that the ground has just confirmed. What was substantial was an aquifer, not a large commercial aquifer, not a municipal supply. Something more modest and more personal, and in the economy of a working piece of land in a dry county, more valuable in a quiet way than either of those. It was a confined layer of permeable sandstone sitting at a depth of between 68 and 81 feet below the surface along that diagonal, and it was fed by the seep at the base of the butte, which was itself fed by a catchment zone on the back face of the formation that was outside the property line, but that had been delivering water into that rock layer continuously since before there was a fence to stand at or a county road to drive past on. Her grandfather had felt it from above and had not had the equipment, or perhaps the confidence, or perhaps simply the time to confirm it. She had come back with the question he had left her and 28 horses who knew how to pay attention, and she had confirmed it. Lloyd wrote up a 2-page assessment in longhand on graph paper that December and told her that a properly permitted well at the high point of the diagonal would likely produce between 6 and 9 gallons per minute at sustainable yield, which in a county where the municipal water district was already talking about curtailment planning and where dry year surface rights were being bought and sold with a seriousness that made the real estate people nervous, was a number worth writing down twice and keeping somewhere dry. She drilled the well in March of 2005. It came in at 7.4 gallons per minute at a depth of 73 feet. She cased it properly, permitted it through the state, and began the process of establishing a water right that would take another 11 months to complete, but that when it was complete, attached to the land a legal and transferable asset that had not existed in any documented form before she arrived with that trailer and those horses and her grandfather's notebook in the fall of 2003. The Alderman place, which nobody had been willing to pay a real price for since the mid-1980s, had been carrying a confirmed productive aquifer and an attachable water right in its north field for as long as the butte had been standing. Nobody had looked. Nobody had looked because nobody had sent 28 animals across it who were too damaged and too attentive to look anywhere but down. I need to tell you about the horses, which is to say, I need to finish telling you about the horses, because I left them in June of 2004 with their pattern established and her map drawn and the water found, and they deserve the rest of their accounting. Of the 28 horses she had brought in that October Tuesday, 22 were riding sound by the following April. Not broke in the way a finished rope horse or a seasoned trail horse is broke, but carrying a rider at a walk and a trot and moving off leg and stopping from a soft rein without any drama about it, which for horses that had come in with the histories they carried was a transformation so complete that people who had known those horses in their rodeo string lives found it difficult to align the animal standing quiet in a snaffle bit with the animal they remembered. She sold 11 of the 22 in the spring and summer of 2005 at prices that ranged from $1,800 to $3,400 a head, and she kept 11. And the 11 she kept were the ones she believed had something still to offer that a single sale wouldn't fully recover. She was right about that, though the proof of it took another 2 years. The remaining 6 of the original 28 were horses she could not bring fully around, not from any failure of method or patience, but from physical unsoundness that the rough history had laid in them too deep to correct. 2 with chronic soft tissue damage in the forelegs, and 2 with a kind of deep nervous anxiety that no consistent work could reach, and that she had decided at some point I was not privy to, was not something she was going to spend their remaining years trying to force away from them. Those 4 she kept for the duration. They lived on the Alderman place and worked the north field with the herd through 4 more grazing seasons, and were, in the accounting she showed me once without being asked, the most expensive horses she owned, and the ones she did not regret for a single day of the expense. The other 2, the ones with the foreleg damage, she found homes for with a therapeutic program 3 counties over that needed quiet horses for mounted work with children, and she priced them at what the program could afford, which was $250 each, and she delivered them herself in the old gooseneck on a Tuesday morning. I note that detail because she seemed, in general, to favor Tuesdays for the things that mattered. I asked her about that once, and she said she didn't think it was Tuesdays specifically. She thought it was just that the things that mattered tended to get done once she'd had the weekend to decide to do them, and Tuesday was where that decision usually landed. That is as close to a philosophy of action as she ever offered me directly, and I have thought about it more than she probably expected. The neighbor who had been most vocal at the diner in the early days, a man who ran a cow-calf operation on the east side of the road, and who had driven past that trailer that October morning with an expression I had been close enough to read, came by the Alderman place in the late summer of 2005. I know this because I was there. I had taken to stopping in more regularly by then, not at the gate, but inside it, helping with things that needed a second set of hands, which is how a friendship that began as curiosity becomes something with a longer tenure. He pulled up in the truck, which was newer than it had been in 2003 and just as clean, and he got out and stood at the top rail and looked at the north field where the herd was out on the late summer grass, 24 horses spread across a field that the county had understood for 30 years as hardpan and wet corners and thin middle ground that wasn't worth the trouble. He stood there for a while without saying anything. She came over and stood beside me, and the 3 of us looked at the field together. He said, "That ground looks like it's carrying more than it used to." She said, "The water helps." He nodded. He looked at the Butte a while, and then at the horses, and then back at the field. He said, "That's not as wet in the corners as it used to be either," which was true because the drainage work she'd done in the wet corners had moved water more efficiently off the surface and down toward the confirmed layer, improving the footing in the low sections that had always drowned out. He stood there another minute, and then he said, "You might not be as wrong about this place as I thought." He said it to the field, not to either of us, which is the honest way a man makes that kind of concession when he has been wrong in public and is not entirely comfortable with the accounting. Then he got in his truck and drove east. She watched him go and did not say anything about it, and I did not either, and we went back to the work we had been doing, which was stringing a new section of fence along the north boundary where the old wire had finally given up its argument with the weather. I will tell you that the silence after he drove away was one of the most comfortable silences I have experienced in my life, and I have lived long enough and worked outdoors long enough to have experienced a fair number. It was the silence of people who have done a thing correctly and do not need to discuss it, which is, in my experience, a silence that only comes when the thing was genuinely hard and genuinely worth doing. I have tried to earn that silence in various ways across my years on this ground, and I do not always manage it, but I know it when it comes, and I know it is the best thing a field can give you that isn't feed or water or a decent summer. My grandfather had a saying that I did not fully understand until I was past the age when a young man believes he understands things. He said that the land tells you the truth about itself, but it will only tell you once per question, and if you miss it, it will wait for the next person who asks in the right language. He meant, I think, that the ground holds its answers without impatience, without any interest in whether you arrive at them quickly or slowly or at all, and that the answers are there in the same form for the person who looks carefully in 1952 as for the person who looks carefully in 2003, and the only variable is whether you come to the ground with the kind of attention that the question requires. Her grandfather had asked the question in the right language, and had not had time to hear the answer. She had come back with 28 horses who asked the question in the only language they knew, which was the language of the body seeking the thing it needs, water and firm ground and a surface honest enough to stand on without anxiety. And the ground had answered in the same language, which was simply a 60-foot wide diagonal of cool, consistent, reliable grass that the horses returned to every morning because the water beneath it was keeping it that way. You cannot fake that. The horses knew that. The horses knew it before Lloyd Sutter put a probe in the ground, and before the well driller arrived in March, and before the water right was permitted, and before anybody changed their understanding of what the Alderman place was worth. The horses knew it on the first warm day in May of 2004, when they moved out onto that north field and began walking the diagonal that had no name yet, and no documentation, and no legal standing, just a rock layer 68 feet down that had been holding clean water through every drought in living memory, and waiting for someone to ask in the right language. The field doesn't care who believes in it. That is the other thing my grandfather said, and the two sayings together make a whole thought. The field holds the truth. The field doesn't care who believes in it, and the truth will be there when you finally come asking in the right language. She came asking. She came asking with a dead man's notebook and 28 animals that the market had decided were worth less than a kill buyer's offer, and the field answered, and the answer was substantial. I want to end by saying one more thing about the horses, because I think the horses deserve the last word here, and not the aquifer or the water right, or the prices things eventually sold for, though I will tell you that the Alderman place sold in 2011 for a number that bore very little resemblance to the number it would have sold for in 2002, and the water right was a line item in that transaction that the buyer's attorney spent 4 hours examining because he wanted to be certain it was real and attached and uncontested, which it was. The last word goes to the horses, because they are the ones who found the thing, and because what they found by being what they were, animals that had been handled roughly and had learned to pay attention to the ground as a matter of survival, and because paying attention to the ground as a matter of survival is, if you follow it all the way to its conclusion, not so different from what any of us are doing out here when we're doing it right. I have been farming this ground for more years than I want to count on a good day. I have learned most of what I know about it slowly, from the ground up, from old notebooks and quiet experts and animals that knew things before I did. I have learned that the credentialed certainty that ends a conversation is often only the beginning of the real one. I have learned that the cheap, overlooked, difficult thing is frequently carrying exactly the answer you need, and the only cost of admission is the patience to ask in the right language and the willingness to wait while the field decides whether you mean it. If you have got your own piece of hard ground, your own animal that knew something before you did, your own notebook left behind by someone who saw the question and didn't get to the answer, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. I read them, and I mean that plainly, not as a courtesy, but as a fact. And if this story was worth your time, subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we do get there. The field always gets there.